All right. Thank you all for joining us on this webinar discussing how to use behavioral intent data to crush your sales prospecting and close more deals. I'm happy to be joined today by Chris Ortolano and Alex Kay. And before we dive in terms of setting the agenda for the call and helping establish what we're hoping to cover, it'd be great to have you both introduce yourselves. And as part of the introduction, if you can give us a brief definition of intent data and your experience with it to date. And Chris, we can start with you.
Hey guys, you're my two favorite Alexes, and I'm honored and delighted to be on this webinar today. Thanks so much. I'm the founder and principal of Outbound Edge. I'm a pipeline process consultant. And when I think about intent, I think of it as more than just interest. I think of it as a key element of intelligence, if you will, that helps to inform a marketing nurture and a sales cadence that helps to define what the goals of a specific account are. So I think of intent as part of my account planning strategy.
That's awesome. And Alex?
Yeah, I'm Alex Kay. I'm the senior consultant at Rose Garden Consulting, where we help sales teams, usually in the small to mid-sized business, create sales processes and sales departments, kind of a turnkey solution for them, where we help them define their processes, handoff, tech stack, hiring, onboarding, all the stuff like that. And intent actually plays a big part in how we define the sales process and the handoff and the conversations that our business development and AEs then have. For me, intent really is kind of the actions, not only is it the actions that people take with you, but really largely outside of you that kind of dictate the key indicators of what they need. The things that they aren't telling you is kind of the meaning behind what they say, right? There's what they say and there's what they mean, and intent is kind of what they mean.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I'm Alex. I'm the growth manager here at LeadSift. And for us, when we talk about behavioral intent data, what we're really focused on is, as Alex touched on, are those actions of our prospects that are outside of our own channels. And so today we're going to walk through a couple of key examples. And if you can imagine traveling on a car down a highway, depending on the size of the car that you're in, there's a number of different things that you could have available to you. And so for us on this journey, we're going to walk through whether you're in a small or compact car with very little additional features, or you're in a mid-sized car that has some more features and some more capabilities available to it, or you're in that SUV, which is loaded and has all of the tools that you can imagine and is essentially driving itself. What we want to try and do today is help you, regardless of the stage you're in or the car that you're in, understand how intent data can play within your process, and regardless of the type of intent that you're using. And so with that being said, let's dive in and really get into the meat of what we want to talk about today and start in that small car. So we're going down the highway, we're in this small car. Chris, can you talk a little bit about being in the small car and the type of information that you have available to you and where some of the issues come up?
Absolutely. So the small car is classified by this concept of outbound cadence from a sales development perspective, where you can use, say, third-party contact data to get somebody to raise their hand, to say that, yes, they're interested. But a lot of times, that's just based on some firmographic or technographic profile. It's our best guess to suggest that they're an ideal account that matches our profile. Intent data helps us to do two things. It helps us to filter those accounts into higher priority accounts and then focus a little bit more on their current needs. And it's that currency, if you will, that intent allows us to start a more focused conversation, but we have to be very careful with how we use intent data to not just repeat it like a parrot, and to actually speak to business outcomes and business objectives based on what that intent suggests.
Yeah, and that's a great point, right? And I think as part of being in this small car, LeadSift definitely fits in that. And the way that we use intent largely is based around how can we be as efficient as possible with our time and hit on those value propositions based on what we know our prospects are doing, right? So it's not that identify some signal, plugging that into a standard cadence of this, we saw you do this action, or we saw this event happen. It's how do we know, based on some of the clients that we worked with in the past, how do we know a business outcome that's relevant to that action that we've just seen, right? And I think that's a very key point to talk about when you look at, especially in this small car, when you don't have a ton of time on your hands to be overly personalized and prioritize leads. How do you efficiently use it without being putting it exactly into that process, right?
Yeah, I feel like in the small car model, it's kind of like when you had like your very first car and it was, bare bones. It's a crank window, it's, manual locks, it's, you maybe have an AM FM radio, so everything takes time, right? Nothing's being done for you. There's no automation going on. That it's really like if you want to roll in the window, if you want to unlock the doors, everything takes manual effort from the person, right? And that's that way that these small businesses, these small car types of places, really everything is time constrained. Everything needs a lever. Everyone has to be done by someone internally. You haven't built up the processes, and you have to prioritize. What are the most important things to get you from point A to point B? Is there a bump in the road? Is it hot in the car? Whatever the situation is. And that's where this intent data helps you prioritize which is the most important, place to touch on first, right? Can it help you inform to have a better conversation? Does it help you know which customers are, potential clients you're talking to, have a more effective conversation, get them in quickly? Because the more you can get people in quickly, that the more you can get on to the next thing, because you are so time constrained. It helps prioritize where you're time constrained.
Yeah, I think one thing a small business can do is start to classify the different types of intent data and which intent data is more valuable to them. So Alex Field, maybe you can tell us a little bit about the LeadSift behavioral intent data, like what that is and how that fits into the other types of intent data that folks might be seeing out there.
Yeah, absolutely. So for us, the way we look at intent is what are the actions that our prospects and target accounts are taking, specifically with our competitors and relevant content from publicly available sources. So if you think about the daily activities of our buyers, typically they're going and leaving digital traces along the way, along the highway per se, if we're sticking to the car analogy, of things that are things that are of interest to them, right? So how can we start to pick up on those traces to piece together a story of what our prospects are interested in, and start to pair that with the information that we already have available to us. And at this point in the journey, it may be something along a firmographic fit, right? So if you're in a small car, chances are you don't have a ton of customers that you're already working with. So how can you establish who are relevant for you to go after? And using firmographic information like the titles that you want to target within an organization, the company size, the industries, to identify those accounts that are best fits for you to go after. And I think you can start to expand on that as you get up into bigger size cars. But at the very core, it's important to understand what are the actions that they're taking on our own content. Do they fit within our buyer persona? What are the actions they're taking on our outside content, and using that to paint a complete picture. And Alex, I know you have some experience in playing around with some of these smaller cars. Can you talk a little bit about that, and from the misconception around intent and fit that you've experienced?
Yeah, absolutely. I think as you just touched on, I know we've talked about many times before, is just that there seems to be a major misconception. I feel like the standard definition of what we consider to be intent tends to be what I consider to be fit, right? It's firmographic data, the size of the company, number of employees, location, industry, tech stack, things like that. But that's more of like, can we just do business? Are they going to be a good fit, a good customer? And because we all know it's best practice that you're not just going to sign anyone who's interested in what you do, right? You want to make people stick around, make sure they're going to be good customers, they renew, they expand, all those good things like that. That's just good strategy. Now, the other part is making sure that, once you can identify that, that's one set of fit data. Intent is really, you've kind of got, first party intent, which you were just talking about, and there's kind of third party, which is what you sell, right? first party intent data is how are they interacting with your website, your content, all of your digital properties, the things that you track firsthand. Third party data is a lot of the stuff you're talking about, the digital footprints out in the world that people leave as they do other things outside of the conversations they're having with you. Now, where I've seen this really help in small car situations, in these small businesses where I said that resource and time constrained, is that if we know which customer or which competitor maybe they're talking to, if we know what they said they say versus what they mean, and we can tell that through intent data, and it helps us have a much more constructive conversation, because we know, like, for example, right now we're working with a client who works in the event space, and they kind of provide tech solutions for, like, event booths and things like that. But if they know who they're talking to, if they know who the competitors they're engaging with, because a lot of times people won't tell you that, right? They kind of cage that information a lot. It's not something they readily share. You know how to position. You can push them towards different things. You can position yourself, that conversation, where your strengths are against that specific competitor, or maybe they're looking for something outside of what you offer, and you can actually, kind of get that car off the road a lot quicker. You can DQ them, so to speak, based on what they're saying versus what they mean, so they're not just jerking you around waiting for a price.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in also. I think intent data can help you to start that conversation with the right set of insights and the right set of stories that are going to resonate with your prospects sooner, rather than just sort of treating it generically.
And one of the oftentimes not talked about use case is in identifying who that ideal buyer persona is for you, right? So one of the things that we can do is, when you start to collect data in terms of who's actively engaging with your competitors, what kind of content are they engaging with, who's putting that out there, you start to understand the funnel of people that you're attracting. So, for example, we thought early on that sales was going to be the number one person that we would talk to. We would provide them a list of data of people that were actively engaging, which is awesome for a salesperson in the right perspective, right? In terms of understanding what it is. So someone is expressing interest. It doesn't mean that they're going to become your client tomorrow, or that they're ultimately that great fit for you immediately, right? There may be some education that needs to happen. They're showing interest in your space, but how do you help them become aware of your product, right? And so understanding what your competitors are doing as well, and from a competitive intel standpoint, and identifying those ideal customer profiles that they're attracting from the content that they're sharing, the actions that people are engaging with them, and who they're bringing in, can help these small cars, focus their attention on the right buyers, right? And in our case, we found out that it was oftentimes someone in marketing that we should be talking to, which initially, based on our own hypothesis without data to back it up, was wrong.
Absolutely. That's a brilliant outcome.
You reminded me of something, actually, when you said that. Was at one of the last companies I was actually working for, we actually used intent data to figure out, and you kind of, both of you actually kind of sparked this, was we were targeting one persona at a company, but also quickly realizing that when they would forward our email and our content onto an exec, a VP or something like that, we could actually gauge their level of sophistication based on what content that they then self-selected, right? So do they have zero concept, or really, I wouldn't say zero concept, I should say maybe a very high level understanding, not in-depth nitty-gritty. They're relying on the person on the ground who we've been interacting with as that subject matter expert, and they're just kind of engaging with the awareness type of content, right? What does this do? Why does it matter type of content, not how to do it type of content. And so you can actually know, we actually use that to gauge what kind of conversations, when to engage that high level that decision maker, or the person has to sign off on it, in the conversation. So it helped us, know what their level of sophistication was, and helped our reps kind of gauge, or are they a super sophisticated CMO, for example, right? And they really want to get into the nitty gritty of how this can add and how it all works and all the, blah, 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 versus, oh, this is what it does, here's the ROI. Right? Those are two very different conversations. We were to come in armed with that information.
Exactly. So you're talking about intent as a part of your playbook to give you a competitive advantage, rather than just using contact data the way so many similar companies are using it.
Yeah,
exactly. So we go to the next car?
Yeah, absolutely. So as we shift into this mid-size or medium-sized car and talk about Chris, I feel like this is the world that you live in terms of helping build these pipeline processes for companies. Can you talk a little bit about what you see in these cars when you hop in?
Absolutely. So there's a lot of ad hoc and sort of communication and silos inside the pipeline, for example, will be single threading. And I think it's really critical to multi-thread once you have established a champion inside the organization. The question is, who else is in your buying group and what are the priorities that they have? So if you use kind of a scout and listen approach, you're going to try and get as much intent data as possible. And then you're going to use insights inside your opportunity to provoke a response. So I'll give you an example. So we use some case studies of companies that are very successful. And what we found is that those case studies weren't really working for us, that they were sort of dry and they were success oriented. So we changed them to be more about the problem that needed to be solved. We call those change stories. And that started to get a lot more response. So what we do is we use stories inside to gather more intent once we're inside an opportunity. And what those stories do is they bring more stakeholders to the table. It's by using the intent data, though, that helps us to normalize the process. And then we start to get more stakeholders involved.
Yeah, no, that's great. And Alex, maybe in terms of, I think you have a use case around turbocharging growth, right? And how do you combine those intent actions that lead to great outcomes at the other side of it?
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing that we've realized in my experience, a few companies ago, I was working for a MarTech company, and the way we used it was to understand basically when to fast track the conversation, right? And that goes back to, we talked about, kind of like the first party intent data, and you got your third party. The first party is what content. Any good marketer knows you're gonna, map your content to your funnel and know which types of conversations, which topics, and that way you're able to accelerate those into a quicker conversation, a quicker handoff. You're basically creating an HOV lane, so to speak, for your pipeline when these people are, showing high intent, they're a good fit, it's the right persona. You can kind of put all that account score and lead score together to realize, oh, we need to turbocharge that, and that's going to accelerate that pipeline. In terms of like prioritization, right? So realizing in this mid-sized car, in this mid-sized company, you have more resources, you have more time, you're not as constrained, you have, it's not so frantic. A lot of these things you're starting to build some processes, but they're not necessarily efficient. So what this allows us to do was, like I said, create a fast lane, an HOV lane, so to speak, for our hot ones, and then as well as create consistency in the process for the way that our SDRs were having conversations, and that way created consistency in our pipeline for the AEs, right? We know that we're consistently getting people into the right things. We're having these meetings show up more often. They're converting at a higher rate and they're closing at a higher rate because we were able to have the right kinds of conversations at the right time and have people, either accelerate, nurture, or DQ based on the intent.
I think to turbocharge, you need two things, right? You need to be multi-threaded. But to do that effectively, you also have to know what types of messages are going to resonate with your different decision makers. Yeah. And so I think intent can help us, but it's not just looking at a raise or a new product or a new hire. It's asking the question, what does that mean? And I think by asking the question and layering that into our messaging, it differentiates you from all the other folks out there who are just saying, hey, you just raised a round, congratulations, and you probably need a new widget. No. So be intentional and be thoughtful, but also recognize that different buyers have different needs inside your account, and you're going to just accelerate way faster and ahead of the other folks who are really kind of monotonous in their messaging.
Yeah, no, and that's, I think, consistently, regardless of the size of the car you're in, that's an important aspect of any kind of external intent data that you use, right? It's very easy to say, if someone comes to your website and downloads a case study, you can be very direct about that. But when you see an action that isn't explicitly available to you, right, and someone's subconscious of understanding, I didn't download that, you have to be direct in nature and understanding what potential challenges are ahead, right? And it comes from a marketing team being able to set you up with messaging, understanding where they're at in the funnel, and the appropriate prioritization, which I think is key with intent data. But you need to be careful to walk that line. And that's a consistent thread, regardless of the car you're in terms of how you communicate with your prospects once they've identified themselves as that fit that you want to reach out to, or that person that you should reach out to, regardless of where the action comes from.
Absolutely.
Cool. And Alex, can you talk just a little bit in this area where some of the strategies you used in terms of understanding how the external content played into that internal content mapping that you had?
Yeah, so it was more of a keyword mapping, I think is kind of the best way to put it, right? Is we identified these really important pieces of the funnel, just like we had internally, we used externally as well. And the way we used them was we kind of created, we combined that lead scoring, both with the like it was almost an intent score internally versus like a lead score. I should say externally versus internally. So I keep going third party over here, first party over here, because that's just the way I think of it. But no, so when we had the keyword mapping, we know when they're gonna be presenting external, and we can compare the two. Are they telling us one thing? Are they engaging with consistently across both, or are they disconnected somehow, right? So to that point of, do we know that they're going to be, if they're on someone else's pricing page, and maybe they haven't gotten there for us, right? We're going to know that they're on a competitor's pricing page, and that's a really important point for us to bring up, and it actually empowers the sales team to have really effective conversations. And I think one of the big things that intent data does, it's really important for what I do, and where we've seen huge leaps in effectiveness for sales teams, is the fact that it actually empowers sales teams to be on a more even playing field with buyers now, right? I think one thing we've realized, and that we all are all aware of with digital marketing, is that buyers are more educated, more empowered than they ever have been before, which is great because you're able to have much more sophisticated conversations. But in a lot of situations, buyers feel so empowered that they don't come to the table as equals with sales, right? Now it's like, I can dictate to you every single thing I want. I know everything about your thing, and I can talk to 5 of your competitors. Well, now we actually know, and sales can actually be on the same playing level. I don't think either side deserves a leg up, but both should come to the table as equals, try and figure out, you've got a problem, I have a solution, can we do business, does it make sense? And this, with the intent data, I believe that actually levels the playing field, where buyers aren't just out there in the ether doing all this activity without us knowing, and then lying to us potentially on the inside, just trying to waste our time, just want to get a price. Maybe they've already agreed to something, but this intent data is the first step in empowering a sales team to have those equal footing conversations.
Yeah, big time. And that is, at the end of the day, and I think as you transition into a bigger car, and we can go to that SUV, it does start to focus on the conversations that you're having, right? And when you're in that midsize, or you're in that middle unit, oftentimes, because there isn't a consistent process potentially in place, you're kind of mismatching this all together. And you can get some historical data to better understand what your buyers do, but you may not have enough to have a formal process in place. But as you start to build out and you're in that SUV now you can start to focus on the conversations. You can start to look at historically, what are your buyers doing? How can we map that? And then how can we leverage that so that, and I know that the number varies, right? So it's anywhere from 67 to 80% of the way through the journey when they actually engage with sales. But how can we get ahead of that to build a robust pipeline and have the conversations that matter around some of the business problems that they're showing you that they have an issue with?
Yeah, I'd like to.
Go ahead, Chris.
So this is the most complex model, right? That car has a GPS system so that you're never going to get lost. It has a TV so your kids aren't going to scream in the back, but you still have to drive that car. You're still looking for, quote, sales intelligence. One of the things I see some of the highest performing outbound sales teams do is creating snippets that they can use to grab quickly and insert into their messaging. Here's an example. If a raise is funded, then add this line to the message that doesn't speak to the raise, that speaks to the challenges associated with growth. If a new hire happens, speak to the kinds of decisions that new hires have to entertain. So you can add those snippets into your email libraries. And so you go, if X, then Y.
And that is big time on the prioritization aspect of it, right? And you think about someone who's going through, let's say that you're engaging with a potential buyer and you're going through a 7 to 8 email sequence or touch point cadence, and you start to see this signal. So let's say that they hire a round, they hire a person or raise a round. If you have those snippets that you can put into a conversation based on the intelligence that's being provided, you don't need to change the whole messaging that you're putting in front of that person, but you instantly just became relevant to their world, which I think as sellers, that is the most important thing that you can be, is showing that you understand their world and then being relevant to them so that you're not wasting their time.
Yeah. And I think that that's one thing that's come up a lot lately is like, there's 3 types of messaging, right? You've got like generic, you've got tailored, then you've got like custom. And I think the most effective recently is the tailored, right? Where it's something you can do at scale. Because, the one-to-one emailing is highly effective, but you can't scale that, right? And the generic is too generic and people just ignore it. But it's like, you can, when you know your use case, when you know your ICP, you don't have to change, to your point, you don't have to change everything about it. You can still put in relevant information. And that's really a scalable way to do targeted sales.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I would encourage sales leaders to start to realize the value of intent and then train their individual contributors in how to interpret the intent data. In my mind, this is more pressing now than ever before, and it's a sales differentiator. A year from now, it'll be table stakes. So we need to get in front of this trend before we fall behind.
Yeah,
absolutely. And so I think one of the things that's important here, and I guess kind of keeping with the SUV sophisticated luxury analogy here, is that a lot of things are automated at this point, right? You think about cars. These cars will parallel park themselves. They'll keep you in the lane. They'll hit the brakes automatically. Your job is really to make sure these things don't crash, right? Your job is to essentially keep it between the lines more so than it did before. And I think to that point, and that's where it's the expanding, this is where like that multi-threaded, expanse, make sure things don't break down, right? Your job is to maintain it, make sure it stays on the track or on the car, on the road, whatever it is. And to that point is, Chris was talking about a multi-threaded approach. And I know, Alex, we've kind of talked about this briefly before, but, in terms of going from just lead scoring and scoring individuals and their intent, and this was something that I experienced at the company I was at before Rose Garden, was our SDRs were prospecting accounts, and they were actually being effective, even though our response rates and stuff like that, we were seeing people click and open, but we weren't getting a lot of responses. And we were trying to figure out what was wrong. So we tried to do the standard A/B testing. We tried to kind of troubleshoot it. We tried to do a lot of things. We realized they were going around our email and just Googling us and coming to our website, right? And then they were also forwarding that email to people who are doing the exact same thing. People have gotten hip and wise to the ways they're being tracked. So they're figuring out new different ways to not be tracked or try not to be. The point is 2 things. They're going to go around you, number 1. And number 2, you need to know when there's multiple people from an account in there. There was a couple times even that we had 5 or 6 people in in our HubSpot who are not connected to a whole account. So we had one person who was highly engaged versus 5 people who were moderately engaged. But the 5 different people who are moderately engaged is a way more valuable opportunity than it would be, than a one person who's highly engaged. And that's that multi-threaded thing that Chris was talking about, that approach, that whole account planning. So rolling up an entire account score. So we're actually moving towards an account-based CRM rather than just account-based marketing, but where everything rolled up to the account level. Everyone's actions, first party, third party, all of that. And that created an entire account score, which helped our team prioritize.
Absolutely. Yeah. Some people refer to that as heat mapping.
Yeah.
It should be.
And
that's something that I work on because it's a differentiator. You don't chase the wrong accounts. And it's that chase, honestly, that kills us. Our most precious commodity is time. And when we can't evaluate or score our opportunities, we end up chasing the wrong deals. We know that 20% of them are going to end up in no decision. Another 20% are closed lost. So if we can start to score properly using intent data, we can hone in on the opportunities with the best chance of winning.
Yeah. And I think a big part of that, to your point, Alex, is understanding the depth of the contacts within the account, right? And we've actually had recently a client who was using our data and looking at it as a one-off engagement. So they were in a very large enterprise sale. And as we know, no enterprise decision now is being made by a single individual. And so what they found is that by just pushing in a single contact and identifying that intent, it wasn't actually indicating a buying interest. What they needed to do was expand on the depth of contacts within that account and who they were looking for engaging, and then provide a multiplier to understand, okay, once we see 2 people that are actively engaging, that's our trigger to go, right? We need to be aware of these folks in this instance and have that intelligence in our back pocket in case they do come and request a demo or do some sort of high value activity. But at its core, what we really need to know is what is the depth of our interest within that account, whether it's on our own channels or our external channels, and then use that to power their messaging and outbound prospecting going forward.
Yeah, and like seeing when that, when that intent, when that engagement starts to spike, and having that be a trigger, right? And know that, good marketing and sales operations people can create those triggers in your software and have those things surface to salespeople at the right time to talk to the right people and have the right conversation.
Exactly. And so with that, I think as we get to the end of the highway, right, I think the easiest way to think about it, and you talked about the HOV lanes, which being in Halifax, we don't have. But the other thing, and Chris, you've talked about these as well, are the highway headlines that you have, those highway alerts that allow you to have an understanding of what's upcoming. And the reality is with intent data or any data that provides some sort of intelligence is it will give you the signs of what's happening ahead. How can you get ahead of it? How do you know what accidents are up there? And the more sophisticated your car is that you're driving in, the more information you'll have available. That may be the amount of time it will take you to get you to your end destination. That may be additional bumps coming up in the road. That may be its ability to self-brake itself because it sees a car ahead. But the reality is that what buyer intent data or behavioral intent data in our case does is it helps paint a clear picture of all of the actions across all of the channels that you can track, whether it's on your own content or the external web. What are those actions that are being taken to make sure that you have all the necessary information to continue on your journey? So I want to make sure that it's set in the proper expectation, not in that we're going to identify these signals and help you close deals tomorrow. It's more so that there may be a ton of bumps in the road, right? And it's regardless of what signal you have, but how can you use that to be as successful as possible?
Exactly. It's not a silver bullet. It just helps you, avoid certain potholes. It helps you kind of have a smoother journey.
Right. And figure out who else is in the car. So what other stakeholders and other people need to be involved. So I know we're short on time. And in terms of wrapping up, are there any final thoughts, Chris?
This is an exciting opportunity, and I would suggest that sales leaders spend some time thinking about how to integrate it into their process and then test it before they start to make some decisions. For me, intent data is about asking better questions, and I think that's what our buyers are expecting of us these days.
Absolutely. And Alex?
Yeah, I agree that it's definitely a way to have a better conversation, right? All it is really a way to have better, more effective conversations, because in reality, that's what sales is. 2 people having a conversation, coming together, trying to find out if the problem you have is something I can solve. Can we do it together? Does it make sense? And I think the more we use it and the more we embrace, the idea that this informs the conversations, but not is the conversation, I think will be better, because too often I think sales leaders, shun data because they think we're trying to tell them what to do, when more so we realize it's just another tool to have better conversations for your reps.
100%. I love that. The inform is a great way to position and understand what this data is there for you, right? Just like that sign on the highway, it's there to inform you. It's not going to change really any of the actions right off the bat. So with that being said, I know we had a couple of live questions, but we had some technical issues that we don't need to get into. But if people want to connect with you both, Chris, what's the best way to connect with you? Definitely plug your Slack channel there.
Absolutely. So the 3 of us are in a community called salesstack.io, all one word. It's a free Slack community. Come to that URL, join the team, meet us, continue the conversation there. Find me on LinkedIn, also Twitter. My handle is @SalesNerdo.
Awesome. And Alex?
Yeah, LinkedIn's probably the best way to get in touch with me as well. Obviously, we're all on sales stack, as Chris said. Great way to have a casual conversation, as well as connect and kind of continue this. So if there's anything that comes up that anyone has questions or curious or wants to bat around, we're always happy to have a conversation.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate your guys' flexibility in getting this done, and look forward to talking again soon.
Looking forward to it. Thanks.
Thanks, Alex.